You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 353, Ratification in New England. Last week, we covered the first 4 state ratifications of the Constitution. 3 of them, Delaware, New Jersey, and Georgia, were all relatively small states that ratified quickly and unanimously. Pennsylvania also ratified, but only after the Anti-Federalists objected to how quickly the Federalists pushed it through. Even so, the state quickly and overwhelmingly ratified the Constitution. Stronger headwinds began to blow as the opposition got more organized, and the more skeptical states began to consider this document. By the end of 1787, just over 3 months after its release, more than 200 printers had reproduced copies of the Constitution across the continent. Essays and editorials, both for and against ratification, pushed their way into the public debate as well. There were a host of reasons that opponents raised, both about the process and the principles. The lack of a Bill of Rights became a major sticking point for many, but the more general philosophical objection was that this new Constitution was an attempt by the powerful and wealthy interests to consolidate power. It was an attempt to deny the states the freedoms they had won in the Revolutionary War. Some argued that this new powerful federal government would be more arbitrary and despotic than even British rule had been. At the same time, the Federalists, that is, supporters of ratification, saw this as a fight between good government and anarchy. The Union, under the Articles of Confederation, was falling apart. States were violating the rights of their own people and were moving closer to war with one another. If left unchecked, it would result in secession, civil war, and perhaps many states returning to British rule to avoid the threats of their neighbor states. Even if this proposed constitution was imperfect, it represented the last best hope to save the Union. They saw the opposition as men who were driven by selfish interests, wanting to hold on to their power at the state level and at the expense of risking the end of the Union. They compared the Anti-Federalists to the Loyalists for their desire to destroy the United States, or as the Shayshites for supporting civil unrest and mob rule over good government. With this ideological conflict raging, the ratification efforts continued. The next state to consider ratification was Connecticut. This was the first New England state to consider the new Constitution. Connecticut had been caught up in the political battles in recent years between the merchant class and the farmers that raged throughout all of New England. These were the same things that resulted in the Shays Rebellion the year before in Massachusetts and the takeover of the Rhode Island government, which destroyed the financial system in the state to assist indebted farmers. Since Connecticut had many of these same divisions, one would expect that there would be divisions over a more powerful federal government that could have more control over taxes, trade, commerce, and financial systems. The leadership in Connecticut seemed all in favor of the new Constitution. This was a document that would bring stability to a region that was threatened with anarchy. While there was still a minority in the legislature that expressed some opposition, they were a minority. Connecticut newspapers all lent their strong support to the Constitution. There were 6 state newspapers at the time. All of them ran numerous essays in favor of the Constitution, including several written by delegates Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth. Although the papers ran a few anti-federalist articles, these were only reprinted from out-of-state papers. They pretty much ignored any local opposition. Local supporter David Humphreys, in a letter to George Washington just after the end of the convention, noted that the professional classes, the clergy, lawyers, physicians, and merchants, all seemed uniformly in favor of the new government, as were former officers from the Continental Army. The Connecticut legislature voted in October, about a month after the convention in Philadelphia had ended, to hold elections for a ratifying convention. That election took place on November 12th, and the convention met beginning on January 3rd, 1788. Many local towns debated the Constitution at town meetings. Some of those who elected delegates to the convention sent them with instructions to vote no. There was certainly disagreement at the ratifying convention, but the majority did not simply push through their vote. The delegates at the convention agreed to go through the Constitution section by section. Roger Sherman, who had been a voice of moderation at the Philadelphia Convention, spoke up as one of the leading advocates at this ratifying convention. The advocacy did have an impact. There were a number of delegates who spoke against the Constitution during the debates, but who ended up voting in favor of ratification. At least one of these violated his instructions to vote no. The final vote for ratification took place on January 9th. The vote of 128 to 40 was not unanimous, as it had been in 3 of the 4 previous conventions, but it was a much larger margin than the vote in the other large state, Pennsylvania, that had already ratified. On the same date, January 9th, that the final ratification vote in Connecticut took place, the Massachusetts Ratification Convention began. Generally speaking, a majority in Massachusetts did seem to be in favor of a stronger federal government. Shays' Rebellion reinforced this view among government leaders who were in favor of greater federal power. Even so, many state leaders seemed skeptical of the Constitution as proposed. A month had passed between the end of the convention in Philadelphia on September 17, 1787, and the assembly of the Massachusetts legislature on October 17th. Several days after the session began, Governor John Hancock presented the Constitution to the legislature. When he did this, Hancock refused to endorse or object to the Constitution, but simply said that it was, quote, not being within the duties of my office to decide upon this momentous affair. Privately, Hancock expressed concerns that the document was subversive of certain inalienable rights, although he really didn't get into specifics. He also commented that it was, quote, not sufficiently democratic and too restrictive of state and local powers. My view is that Hancock was behaving like a politician, mostly waiting to see how public opinion turned on the matter before committing himself. But he certainly wasn't leading in either direction on this issue. Samuel Adams at this time was president of the state Senate. He came out against the Constitution initially, seeing a powerful national government as a threat to Massachusetts sovereignty. He thought the U.S. was too large to be governed by a single government, and that it could only work as a federal union of sovereign states. And this proposal went too far in giving too much power to the central government. Despite his reservations, Adams was also cautious politically. Although he did voice his concerns, he did not declare himself a full-throated opponent of ratification. He also seemed willing to reconsider his views on the topic if public opinion swayed one way or the other. Perhaps the loudest voice that was in opposition to ratification was Elbridge Gerry. He was one of the most active delegates at the convention and one of only 3 men who were there on the last day and refused to sign the document. Gerry had gone to the Philadelphia Convention in favor of a more powerful central government, but as the Constitution developed in Philadelphia, Gerry's opposition grew. By August, he had become an opponent. The proposed Constitution was too powerful and endangered the, quote, liberties of the people and the independence of the states. He feared this new government would eventually morph into an aristocracy or a monarchy. Nathan Dane, who had spoken against the Constitution at the Confederation Congress in New York, also became an outspoken opponent of ratification in Massachusetts. Speaker of the House, James Warren, also opposed ratification, writing several pamphlets in opposition. His wife, Mercy Otis Warren, also wrote a pamphlet against ratification. So the top elected leadership of the state stood somewhere between tepidly opposed to the Constitution and very opposed to the Constitution. The leadership was not strongly in favor, as we've seen in all the other previous states where ratification had been considered up until this point. Support for ratification fell to 2 of the convention delegates, Rufus King and Nathaniel Gorham. Both of them led the campaign in favor. King regularly corresponded with James Madison to keep him informed of progress. Gorham did not participate much in the debates because he had been chairman of the Committee of the Whole during the Philadelphia Convention and therefore could not participate as an advocate one way or the other. But he strongly supported the Constitution and the ratification process in his home state of Massachusetts. Another person you might think might have an interest in this was John Adams. but he was still serving in London and could not really participate in the debate. Elbridge Gerry sent Adams a copy of the proposed Constitution. Adams wrote back expressing some concerns, but ultimately favored ratification. Even so, his absence from the country meant that he could not have a meaningful voice in this debate. Because there was not unified support among the state leaders, there was much greater doubt about the outcome in Massachusetts. No unified group of opinion leaders was around to push the popular sentiment in favor of ratification. In previous episodes, we've discussed the political divide that existed in Massachusetts this time between the farmers, primarily in the western part of the state, and the merchant class in the eastern part. When it came to ratification, the farmers opposed it, the merchants supported it. Gerry kicked off the opposition debate by sending a letter to the legislature explaining his objections that had caused him to refuse to sign the Constitution. These objections were reprinted and circulated in local newspapers. Massachusetts had 12 newspapers at the time, all of which printed the proposed Constitution itself. Several began printing articles from the Pennsylvania ratification debate. We see opinions by James Wilson and Benjamin Franklin, both supporters of the Constitution, being published. Articles from other out-of-state debates also found their way into the papers. The majority of articles printed favored the Constitution, but there were quite a few in opposition as well. There were actually very few articles written in Massachusetts in the early weeks of the debate. After formally receiving the proposed Constitution on October 18th, the Massachusetts legislature did what all legislatures do. It formed a committee to study the matter. The committee reported back a day later with recommendations to call the convention, that the voters should choose the delegates to the convention, and that the number of delegates would be the same for each town district that they had for representatives in the state legislature. In other words, representation would be based on population rather than a fixed number from each county, as we've seen in earlier states. Initially, the convention was set to begin on December 12th. There was some argument over whether the towns would have to pay the expenses of their delegates. At that point, there was a suggestion just to hold the votes at the town meetings and not have a statewide convention. This was shot down, and the legislature eventually agreed to cover the costs of the delegates. There were also those in the legislature who argued against the convention entirely. They gave the same arguments that we heard in other states, that the Philadelphia Convention had exceeded its authority by creating a new government, and that these changes violated the requirement that all amendments to the Articles of Confederation be unanimous. The majority in the legislature, however, thought that all of these complaints were something that could be discussed at the convention. They set the election of delegates beginning on November 19th and the convention to begin on January 9th. More than 300 Massachusetts towns held elections for delegates. Some didn't get around to that selection until January 7th, just 2 days before the ratifying convention began. There were probably close to 400 delegates who attended. The ratifying convention first met at the State House, but the size of the convention, along with large numbers of people who wished to observe the convention, resulted in officials moving to a much larger church on Brattle Street and then to an even larger one on Long Lane, which is today Federal Street. As we had seen in Pennsylvania, the pro-ratification delegates hoped for a quick vote of approval without amendments. However, it became apparent that a majority of delegates were inclined to vote no. A great many of them had been sent with instructions by their towns to vote no. The Massachusetts tradition of citizen debate and involvement in such issues resulted in an extended debate at the convention. Delegates agreed to go through the document, looking at each paragraph and letting everyone express their views. Rather than wrapping up the convention in a week, which we saw in earlier states, the Massachusetts Convention debated for a month. Over the course of the debates, several delegates who had initially been hesitant to support ratification did in fact change their minds. Samuel Adams muted his initial objections, especially after a group of tradesmen in Boston voted in favor of ratification and warned that anyone who opposed it was working against their interests. These men were convinced that the Constitution would improve trade and would therefore improve Boston's economy and create more jobs. Samuel Adams, who relied on these men as part of the core of his political base, saw good reason not to oppose them. Former Governor James Bowdoin held a dinner shortly before the convention where all the other Boston delegates expressed support. The merchant community also favored ratification. The result was that Adams moved from being opposed to, quote, listening at the convention, and he eventually supported ratification. Although John Hancock had been chosen as president of the ratifying convention, he did not even show up for the first 3 weeks. He claimed his gout was acting up. Many at the time saw this more as a matter of not wanting to commit to either side. Rufus King suggested that Hancock's health would improve, quote, as soon as a majority shows itself on either side of the convention. The Federalists met with the governor in his sickbed, trying to get him to back ratification. They offered him support for his re-election. They also tried to appeal to his ego, suggesting that he might become the first president of the United States if Virginia failed to ratify. Hancock finally went to the convention on January 30th and offered his first comments the following day. Up until that time, the convention seemed pretty evenly split. Opponents objected to all sorts of things: the absence of a Bill of Rights, the lengthy terms of senators and representatives, the system for electing the president, too powerful a judiciary, the power to impose direct taxes, and on and on and on. There were also objections to continuing the slave trade and giving Southerners voting power based on their slaves. Some objected also to the lack of a religious oath for office holders. The strongest opposition, though, came from the farmers of western Massachusetts, still reeling from Shays' Rebellion and the policies that led to it. They feared that federal restrictions on paper money and debtor relief were going to just destroy them. Given the divisions in the state, I'd guess that most western farmers would have objected for no other reason than that the eastern merchants supported it. They were so divided and saw their interests as so divergent that it was difficult for the two groups to agree on anything. Hancock recommended that the convention ratify the Constitution. To placate the opponents, he recommended a specific list of amendments. While they needed to ratify the Constitution unconditionally in order to keep the process moving, these amendments would be addressed by the new government. Samuel Adams seconded Hancock's proposal. The amendments went to a committee which made some minor alterations. In the end, the ratifying convention settled on 9 suggested changes. The first was that all powers not explicitly granted to the federal government in this document be retained by the states. In other words, this was going to be a limited government, not one with all the implied powers of a sovereign. Second, there would be 1 representative for every 30,000 people. Massachusetts believed that representation had to be kept to a very small number of constituents in order to remain democratic. Third, that Congress could not set a date for elections unless a state refuses to hold free elections on its own. Massachusetts wanted to be able to set its own dates for its own elections. Fourth, that Congress not levy direct taxes on the people, but rather only on the states. Fifth, that Congress not give any merchants exclusive advantages of commerce, i.e. monopolies. Sixth, that grand juries be guaranteed for indictments. Seventh, that federal courts not hear cases between citizens of different states unless the matter exceeded $1,500. Eighth, that civil trials be tried by jury. And ninth, that no person holding a federal office accept a title or office from a foreign king or state. With agreement on these changes, a week later, on February 6th, the convention held a vote on ratification, which would be transmitted back to the Confederation Congress with their suggested changes. The final vote was 187 in favor of ratification and 168 opposed, so a fairly close vote. Massachusetts ratification was critical to the process given the importance of that state, but the close vote and the need to suggest amendments would provide ammunition for anti-federalists in future ratifying conventions. These suggested amendments circulated widely throughout the country and became a basis for more debate. I want to touch on Rhode Island real quick while we're still in New England. A month after Massachusetts ratification, the process suffered its first setback. Rhode Island seemed to be a hotbed of opposition. Now, at first glance, one might think Rhode Island would support constitutions for the reasons that other small states like Delaware, Georgia, and New Jersey had. Rhode Island, however, was still dominated by a government pushing cheap paper money that benefited the indebted farmers of the state, and the Constitution was going to put a stop to that. The Rhode Island legislature did not meet until February 25th, 1788, when some delegates called for a ratifying convention. The legislature voted it down by a vote of 43 to 15. Instead, the legislators argued that such an important change be sent directly to the voters as a referendum, which would be voted on at town meetings. On March 24th, voters rejected the Constitution by a vote of 2,714 to 238. More than 90% of those voting opposed it. Part of the lopsided vote was due to the fact that two larger towns, Providence and Newport, refused to participate in the referendum. They still wanted to call a convention. Another vote by the legislature for a convention also failed. The state held its annual elections in April, where the Merchant Party hoped to regain power and get support for the Constitution. Instead, the Country Party, which opposed ratification, won in another landslide. Even later that year, after it was clear that the Constitution was going into effect, the legislature decisively voted down another attempt to hold a convention. The people of Rhode Island decided that even if the United States was forming under a new constitution, they were not going to be a part of it. Next week, the ratification fight continues over the summer of 1788. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. And thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters Chasen Harrison, Anthony McGinnis, and Gordon Kemp. I really do appreciate everyone who can support me on Patreon. Remember that for as little as $2 a month, you can get access to ad-free episodes on my Patreon feed. You can also make a one-time gift via PayPal or Venmo, and I also appreciate everyone who uses one of my links when making a purchase on Amazon. Just using that link to get to Amazon allows the podcast to get a commission on whatever you were going to buy anyway. For anyone who's interested, I am going to be manning a booth at The Skirmish in Haddonfield, New Jersey, on Saturday, June 7th, 2025. This is going to be a living history event with demonstrations and reenactors. It's completely free. If you're within driving distance of Haddonfield, stop by, check it out. This week we covered the first ratifications in New England. Connecticut went through pretty smoothly. Massachusetts, not so much. As I said in the main episode, the top political leaders in the state were not too keen on the idea of ratification, so went through by a very narrow margin. One thing that Massachusetts did do, which had not been done before in the other ratifying conventions, was making a number of suggested changes to the Constitution. And as we cover the later ratifications, we'll see that this becomes more of a norm for the ratifying conventions. But I want to go through the suggested changes that Massachusetts made and let you know what became of them. Their first suggestion was powers not explicitly granted to the federal government remain with the states. This is essentially what became the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights. Their second suggestion was to have one representative for every 3,000 people. That never took place. Congress did greatly increase the number of representatives after the 1790 census. The House of Representatives went from 65 people to 105, and that worked out to about one representative for every 36,000 people. And that's assuming you count slaves as 3/5 of a person, as they did at the time. The third and fourth suggestions were just suggestions that Congress not act on powers that they were given in the Constitution. One of those was that Congress can set a date for elections. They did not do that until 1845. They left the scheduling up to the states. As far as levying direct taxes on the people, that did not happen until the Civil War, when the government first levied an income tax. The fifth suggestion, I don't think the federal government ever granted private monopolies, similar to something we saw in England with the British East India Company. Individual states, though, did begin granting lots of monopolies in the early federal era. Most of these were for things like building canals or bridges and later railroads. The sixth suggestion, that grand juries be used for indictments, became part of the Fifth Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Their seventh suggestion, to limit federal jurisdiction in civil cases to matters above $1,500, the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789 did put a money limitation, but it limited it to just $500. The eighth suggestion, that of trial by jury, became part of the Sixth Amendment to the Bill of Rights. And the ninth and final suggestion was that Congress not exercise its power to allow any person holding federal office the right to receive a title of nobility from a foreign king or sovereign. I don't think Congress has ever granted such permission, and I'm not sure that anyone has ever asked for such permission. So overall, I think these suggestions did receive reasonable consideration. Of course, given that most people across the country agreed with them, it was not difficult for Congress to comply. Those elected to office were already predisposed to support these sorts of ideas. I mostly focused on Massachusetts today since, as I said, Connecticut proved pretty quick and easy. We will certainly cover more about Rhode Island in a future episode since, spoiler alert, they do eventually join the Union, but it's not until well after the U.S. has started and a new government has already been elected. My book recommendation this week is called This Momentous Affair, Massachusetts and the Ratification of the Constitution of the United States, 1787, by Thomas O'Connor and Alan Rogers. This book goes through the events leading up to the Constitution and the Convention itself, but then the latter part of the book focuses specifically on the ratification debate in Massachusetts. This book was written as a part of the bicentennial of the Constitution. It was published in 1987. It was a project of the Boston Public Library. It's a relatively short book at just over 100 pages, but if you're looking for something specific to Massachusetts, this is the most current book you're going to find. You can buy a used copy, but there is also a borrow-only copy that is available on archive.org. My online recommendation, it covers a similar topic. This is an older book by Samuel Harding called The Contest Over the Ratification of the Federal Constitution in the State of Massachusetts. This book actually gives more details on the ratification in Massachusetts. The main part of the book is just over 100 pages, but unlike my book recommendation, it doesn't waste a lot of time telling you about events leading up to the convention or the convention itself. It really just focuses on the ratification in Massachusetts. Beyond that, there's some appendices with some of the main articles and editorials that were written during the ratification debate, so if you want to read some of those, this is a good book for you. The book is available on archive.org. It was published in 1896, so of course it's in the public domain and available as a download. As always, I've included direct links on my blog and website. I'll also mention as an aside that last week I talked a lot about the University of Wisconsin project on ratification. If you really want to get into the weeds, this project published 4 whole volumes plus a 5th supplementary volume just on the Massachusetts ratification, so all the detail you could possibly want and probably more. There's also 3 volumes plus a supplement for Rhode Island. Connecticut just gets part of 1 volume and 1 supplementary volume. I've included links for all these volumes at the bottom of my blog entry for this episode, but as I said, this is for people who really want to get into the weeds, to look at original information, read original editorials, that sort of thing. This is the place where you want to go for that sort of research, but it really is a lot of information and very detailed information. It's not for light reading. My question this week asks, can George Washington be indirectly credited with starting the United States Revolutionary War? I'm guessing this question is pointing to Washington's role in starting the French and Indian War, the outcome of which created the circumstances that eventually led to the Revolutionary War. We all know that a young George Washington commanded a force of Virginia militia around what is today Pittsburgh. There, his force killed some French soldiers. Later, the French captured Washington, forcing him to sign a confession, admitted to killing those French soldiers, and many see that as the basis of the French and Indian War, which of course led to the 7 Years' War in Europe. Now, many will argue that the costs of the 7 Years' War eventually led to the taxes that germinated the dispute between Britain and her colonies, and that eventually led to the Revolutionary War. So it is a very indirect path with a lot of things happening in between, but Washington did play a key role in kicking off all those events. But I wouldn't take that to mean that Washington was critical to starting the war. You have to consider that if Washington had not accepted the commission from the governor of Virginia to lead those militia into the disputed areas with France, it's quite likely that someone else would have done so and might have resulted in a very similar outcome. The dispute over these territories almost inevitably would have led to war at some point, so I'm not sure it's fair to argue that the war was just fault of something Washington alone could have done. That said, he was the guy who led it, and those actions did lead to war. The next question to ask, of course, is whether the French and Indian War and 7 Years' War led directly to the American Revolution. Clearly, the taxes imposed after the war formed the basis of the dispute between Britain and the colonies. I think you could argue, however, that those taxes might have been implemented even if there had not been a war. The other big change that occurred near the end of the 7 Years' War was the death of King George II and the rise of King George III. This brought in a very different government. Britain would have needed money even without the 7 Years' War. The new government believed that taxing the colonies, which had matured to the point where they had economies that could be taxed, was now possible. British leaders in Parliament might have imposed those taxes, even absent the war that increased Britain's debts. The war also turned over Canada from France to Britain, so it's possible the colonies might have been more concerned about breaking with Britain if there was a large French presence directly to their north, but you could argue that if Britain had imposed those taxes, the fight might have evolved differently, but it still would have evolved. British colonies might have been willing to work with France to achieve independence over the tax issue anyway. France would be happy with an independent U.S. on the southern border of French Canada than they would be with British colonies there. So all this is a long way of saying that events could have unfolded in a very similar way, even if Washington had not played a role in it. I think Washington did play a very unique role in helping the colonies actually win their independence, but whether the war would have started even absent Washington, I think you can make a good case for as well. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.